Welcome back to the Argus Biomass podcast. This is our our summer bonus episode, excuse me, where we'll be focusing for the first time on the Asia Pacific biomass market. We've actually got two podcasts this month, but this is our first foray into the Asian market, so we're very excited. I've got my colleague Claire Picard-Cambridge with me today. Claire is Claire manages our editorial presence in Asia on solid fuels, including biomass. So I thought I'd perhaps hand over to you, Claire, to start off with some comments about the Asia Pacific market.
Thanks, Freddie. I thought that what I could do conversationally is just touch on some of the big policy issues that have been driving the key markets in Asia, which would be South Korea and Japan, because really these are the most important sort of landmarks to watch. And of course, there's also been a little bit of a reaction to the COVID-19 pandemic, but in a way that's been still continues to be dwarfed by, it's still a bit secondary to the policy issues. So in terms of South Korea, I think that the biggest development in the seaborne market for Asian wood pellets generally has been that South Korea's imports have been considerably weaker this year, and that's because of the change in government policy that incentivizes the use of domestic biomass from forests in South Korea. So this is the issue you keep hearing about, which is unused woody biomass, because it would not otherwise be used for any industrial function. And the reason why the government pushes this is because it wants to encourage waste wood clearance from forests and reduce the risk of fires in the country. So it gives very generous incentives for those and is penalizing wood pellet imports instead. So we see that wood pellet imports in the first half of 2020 have been at 1.37 million tons into South Korea, which is about 15% down from last year. So this big growth trend that we've been talking about every year definitely seems to be at a standstill and falling. So more recently, so that was the one thing. Then more recently, and in fact effective from this month, July, the government in South Korea cut the amount of renewable energy credits, RECs, that most state-owned utilities may earn by co-firing with wood pellets. So they've been cut from 1 REC per megawatt hour to half an REC. And this really affects the state-owned utilities, which are so dominant in Korea, with the exception of the largest one, Koen. It's exempt. But demand for unused woody biomass from the state-owned utilities is therefore going up very much. They're issuing many more tenders because unused woody biomass still earns 1.5 RECs per megawatt hour. So that's 3 times more REC credits than burning imported wood pellets. So you can see what a sea change has occurred there. And it's also worth noting that South Korea introduced a slightly tighter wood pellet standard officially from this month, July, and the Argus wood pellet methodology has changed accordingly to accommodate that for both FOB Vietnam wood pellet assessments. Vietnam supplies nearly something like 75 to 80% of South Korea's imports. And also for our CFR South Korea wood pellet price. So we had been expecting that to actually push up the price of Vietnamese wood pellets, but it hasn't, because I think they were very organized and these suppliers were well prepared for the change. So we didn't see any shortages emerge. So I think that deals with the key issues in South Korea. If I move on to Japan, I would say that palm kernel shell sustainability certification has been a really big issue. And that was the big worry last year, was that what would METI decide about sustainability certification rules for PKS, palm kernel shells. So these certification rules have already been in place for some years in Japan on wood pellets. But the Japanese industry had been very concerned that there wouldn't be enough certified PKS to go around if strict certification rules were set. And you have to appreciate, of course, that a number of dedicated biomass power plants started up in Japan this year. And so PKS imports have continued to go up into the country. And in fact, they hit an all-time high in May, and they were double that of May last year. So the deal now is that Japan is accepting certification that satisfies its general criteria. And they've agreed on those criteria, which sort of are about sustainability, legality, social practices, no child labor, that sort of thing. And so, in fact, a range of certification schemes like RSPO and so on are acceptable, although a few schemes declined to partake in certifying PKS. So really the fears last year that as much as half of the PKS going to Japan could be excluded, those fears have not materialized. And I think, Freddie, you can probably attest to this yourself, that Japan does not tend to do radical things in a hurry when it comes to its fuel supply, and it's already demonstrated a lot of commitment to supporting renewables with its feed-in tariff.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. I think it's quite a nice comparison to draw there between Korea and Japan, where you mentioned, Claire, that in Japan they tend not to do things too radically or too quickly. And I think, do you think it's fair to say that there's been kind of steady incremental growth in Japan in terms of biomass consumption, biomass usage and purchasing, and whereas in Korea it's been a little bit more haphazard and kind of spiky in terms of volumes coming in and dropping off.
Absolutely, Freddie. I think South Korea is a tough market for quite a lot of international suppliers. Profit margins are very slim into South Korea. The state-owned utilities there drive a pretty hard bargain. We've certainly seen that, of course, Japan has the feed-in tariff scheme, which does provide for better payment on biomass that you supply. Although I think I have to mention that the Japanese burden, the country's cost burden under the feed-in tariff scheme has really been growing in line with the big expansion in renewable power capacity. And we wrote about it this week out of our Japan office, that surcharges that are passed on to the power consumers as a result of the feed-in tariff now account for more than 10% in electricity bills. And that data comes from a METI survey. So the FIT surcharge costs must be something like 4 times higher than they were 5 years ago. So Japan's really going to have to think about that. And there's been a lot of discussion in Japan about the high cost of biomass as a source of renewable power. So they remain very committed to biomass, but cross-sectoral government ministries have been meeting to study how to bring down biomass power costs. And I mean, this is going to be very challenging. I mean, they're going to have to look at big things like better forest management, planting perhaps faster growing forests, reducing transport costs. I mean, these are crucial if biomass is going to remain an important component when the feed-in tariff expires. And as you would know, that scheme lasts for 20 years for a project at a fixed power price.
That's really interesting. Can't help but draw some parallels to the European market, in the sense that by its very nature, a heavily subsidised market only has a very sort of limited time that it can run, and it's up. And I guess the idea is up to the market to figure out those efficiencies that are required in order to make it kind of stand on its own 2 feet. And it's interesting to see that there's discussion about that at the government level in Japan in particular. And I guess, it's certainly something that we're seeing in Europe, where even Drax has come out publicly recently and said that biomass has to be cost efficient without subsidy by a certain period of time, forget exactly when it is, but it's in the mid 2020s in order for it to work, and that makes perfect sense, really. So in terms of, obviously the buzzword at the moment is COVID, for better or worse, and what would you say has been the kind of impact, directly or indirectly on what's been happening in particular in Japan and Korea over the past sort of 3 or 4 months? Has there been a direct or indirect impact?
Gosh, well, Japan in particular orders its material so far in advance that I am not aware yet of a major impact on the buy side, but we have seen some issues on the supply side. And I'm saying this with a proviso that, of course, we haven't seen the most recent import data and so on. But I think the most noticeable thing would be what's been happening in Malaysia and Indonesia as big sort of supply centres on the palm kernel shell front. And Malaysia's movement control order, which was from sort of March 18, and I think it must have ended somewhere around June the 9th, was very strict initially, and then things kind of eased up during that 2.5-month period. But it initially led to a really sudden halt in production of wood pellets. Some of those exports have gradually resumed, but that did mean that Malaysia lost a little bit of market share on the seaborne side. So we're already aware of that impact. And then there was a lot of talk about shortages of labor on the big palm plantations. This partly happened in Indonesia, but it was more noticeable in the Malaysian-administered part of Borneo. So some of the foreign workers that are employed on these plantations have not been able to come back easily in the Borneo part. But Peninsular Malaysia on the palm plantations, that doesn't seem to be such a problem. In many ways, I think the bigger issues have been, weather and seasonal issues. There's been a low crop of palm kernel shells in Indonesia. So that's sort of been the key reason for the tighter supply of PKS, although COVID played a part. And I almost forgot to mention that another COVID impact has been the increasing availability of domestic wood chips in northern Japan. And that's been because the lumber exports that they normally make to China were halted because of the COVID pandemic. And then on top of that, Japanese paper demand's been down as well. So what we've seen is that for the first time in a long time, a lot more Japanese wood chips are going to power plants instead of paper mills. And so that's kind of filled the gap a bit that's been left by a very tight supply of PKS.
Yeah. Okay. And that's really interesting. So, like some of the fairly unique kind of factors that are impacting the market, particularly in Asia Pacific. And I'm just curious because obviously with a tighter supply on PKS, but relatively more abundant supply of wood chip and potentially wood pellet now that everything's back up and running as people think it ought to. What's been the impact on the pricing of PKS versus wood pellet?
Good question. I think we've already seen some very interesting developments. And the big traditional price premium that wood pellets always enjoyed over PKS in Asia was reversed round about March. And just by way of background, wood pellets obviously are much costlier to produce than PKS, which is simply a waste product to be collected at the mills. And then wood pellets are much more expensive to store than PKS because they spoil more easily. So of course it makes sense that traditionally wood pellets enjoyed a huge premium over PKS if you compare the FOB assessments that Argus does. But earlier this year, let's say from March, the spot PKS FOB East Coast Sumatra price, which is where most Indonesian PKS is exported from, was around $18 higher, according to our assessments, than the FOB Vietnam spot wood pellet price. So PKS keeps climbing the price. It's at about $111 a ton this week. compared with something like $93 a ton for Vietnam for industrial wood pellets. And the key thing has just been that you've had a big hike in Indonesian export taxes. They do vary by month, but they've been very volatile, and that's put a lot of extra cost into the PKS sort of package. And then I mentioned the tighter supply of fruit bunches on the palm plantations in Indonesia. So, and a little bit of the impact of COVID on those plantations. But by comparison, on the wood pellet side, prices have been falling for quite a long time now because Vietnam's dominant market, which is South Korea, its demand's been much weaker for seaborne imports. And this has been because unused domestic woody biomass is becoming much more commonly used in South Korea. It's displacing some of the seaborne wood pellet imports. So I would say that Vietnamese suppliers haven't really been affected by COVID. They've managed their outbreaks, well, I think they've had one death. And so Vietnam is exporting in an undiminished way. But remember that South Korea's REC prices, which I was talking about earlier, that credit, which would support demand for wood pellets, that's really fallen steadily this year. So people often forget that the RECs are absolutely critical to this price picture. And they're about 40% cheaper than the 2019 price average. So they stand at something like $37 or $38 per REC. So you can really earn quite a lot from the renewable energy credits that you gain by generating renewable power.
Yeah, it's a fascinating picture that you're painting in Asia of all the the various factors that are both directly and indirectly related to COVID and not related to COVID at all, particularly on the policy front. I think it's fascinating, and just to see that play out in terms of pricing in the market, particularly with us seeing a nearly $20 premium of PKS over manufactured wood pellet. So one other area that I wanted to explore with you, Claire, and this is something that comes up in a lot of conversations that I have in the biomass market, is the point of kind of intersection between the Asia Pacific market and the Atlantic Basin market, right? So, I mean, typically the conversation is very much around a lot of North American wood pellet production facilities were designed and manufactured and started running to service the Atlantic market. So the North European utilities that are burning wood pellets and have been for the last over a decade now. But obviously, since there's been a lot more demand and kind of rapidly growing demand in Northeast Asia, in Korea and in particular in Japan, that's kind of diverted cargo away from the Atlantic Basin. It's been bringing Canadian volumes out of the Atlantic Basin and into the Asia Pacific Basin. Mm-hmm. Now, I just wanted to see if you had any thoughts on that, or potentially with wood pellet prices being so low in Asia now, whether there's actually going to be a kind of draw back the other way.
Gosh, well, your point about Canadian and US exporters having done very well in Japan really stands. I mean, they've secured extremely long-term contracts for wood pellets to Japan. And, I think the Japanese feel that these deals are very favorable in the sense that you're getting a very high quality product. There are no issues around certification and so on. And these are very well capitalized, reliable exporters. So that still stands. But we have seen that supplies to South Korea from Canada and Russia, which used to be something that I noticed quite a bit in import data in years past, they've really gradually dwindled in recent years. And that's because the profit margin into South Korea is just so slim. It's not worth it for them selling to the Korean Genkos. And of course, Vietnam has just become incredibly competitive. Many more of those producers have become, or gradually becoming certified, really short haul. So Vietnam's now the dominant supplier. It's displaced Canada as the leading supplier to Japan for wood pellets. But it's not so much that Canada's suppliers have diminished. It's not that. It's just that, of course, Japan's demand has been increasing. So Vietnam's done well out of that. I would say that there was quite a lot of talk about a year to 18 months ago about what were then very high prices for biomass in Europe could eventually present a potential arbitrage for Asian exports to Europe, given that Asian wood pellets were so cheap by comparison. And I remember talking to some Russian traders about this, and they said, obviously this would only work occasionally when freight prices were very low to compensate for the long journey. And around about that time, we started to see a sprinkling of test cargoes of PKS going to Eastern Europe. So quite a few. I don't think we saw much in the way of wood pellets going to Europe. In fact, I wasn't aware of any cargoes, but this could certainly change eventually if circumstances are right. But now, of course, with European prices being so much lower than they were, I mean, that discussion has kind of dropped away. But I have seen some small exporters coming into the market. For instance, we've seen New Zealand exporting wood pellets to Japan. And Japan's definitely going out of its way to diversify its sources. I'd say that since 2019, they've also been buying wood pellets from Thailand. So Japan's always thinking a long way ahead about how to ensure it's got sufficient supply.
Yes, they do seem to like diversification on the supply side.
Absolutely.
Which makes perfect sense, really.
Yeah. But Freddie, I'm sorry, just to interrupt. I definitely don't think that what we see in the much more developed coal markets, where you have swing suppliers and a lot of changes depending on pricing. We don't see that kind of jumping about.
Yeah, that seems to be a lot more regionalised, should we say, than perhaps people anticipated it would be.
Yeah.
And that's obviously largely driven by the low price environment that tends to kind of shorten the trade flows. But yeah, it's very interesting nonetheless. I think we've probably come to the end now, Claire. But thank you very much for your insight. It's been a really fascinating chat. I thoroughly enjoyed it. And we'll be back for another podcast very soon. Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Freddie.